Well, as we approach our national celebration of Thanksgiving here in this country, many of us have our minds on a family gathering, on turkey, maybe football if you watch football on TV, and of course, on giving thanks to God for all His blessings, for all His provision. But I always think it's amazing that as soon as Thanksgiving is over, we shift modes to a frenetic pace of shopping, starting with Black Friday. For the few years, some stores even opened up on Thursday. I think that's kind of ending, and I'm glad it is. So certainly on Friday, we start shopping for things that we just have to have for Christmas. I mean, this is after we've thanked God for giving us everything that we need. And yet we go out and buy things that we've got to have. And I understand that, but I just think there's sometimes something foolish about the way we live our lives, especially if our lives reveal the foolishness of ingratitude. That's what I want to talk to you about today, the foolishness of ingratitude. Baptist pastor Adrian Rogers said that there is no sin greater than the sin of ingratitude. There is no sin greater than the sin of ingratitude. But this is why this is important for us. Let me tell you why I think it's important for us to talk about this today, to talk about the sin of ingratitude, to talk about the foolishness of ingratitude. Here's why I think it's important. The foolishness of ingratitude is insidious. It affects us in subtle and gradual ways so that a lot of times we don't even realize we're being foolish with our lives. We don't realize we're having foolish thoughts and taking foolish steps that reveal our ingratitude to God. Because the foolishness of ingratitude creeps into our lives and it causes us to make foolish decisions based on foolish perceptions. So what I want to do today in this message is I want to share with you some signs of what it means to live foolishly, what it is to live foolishly, so that we can use these signs to evaluate our lives. We're going to read a story that Jesus told in Luke chapter 12 and Luke 12, and I want to highlight some things that I think will help us to evaluate our lives so that we learn not to live foolishly, but to live wisely. So we find these lessons in this story that Jesus told in Luke 12. I'm going to ask you to read. There are no slides for this, so just read in your Bibles Luke 12, beginning with verse 13. Luke 12:13, all the way to verse 21. Reads like this. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Let me pause there and say, by the way, this is something that rabbis would do. This is not really, you might think by Jesus' answer, this is a really random request, but this is something that rabbis would do. They would step in when there was some kind of family conflict regarding their inheritance. And so this person said to him, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me," would have been common, but Jesus is about to teach them something new, something different here. So he replies, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out." So he uses this scenario to teach this lesson and tell the story. He says, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Now, Jesus tells this story, and he's very specific, and not in this story, but earlier, in another instance, he's specific about the use of the word fool. He's very particular about the use of the word fool. In fact, he warned against it. He said, don't call anybody a fool. And he went as far as to say that anyone who calls another person fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. So that sounds pretty serious, right? That's a pretty serious warning. Don't call anybody a fool. Why do you think that is? Why do you think he said that? Well, I think the reason has to do with the hate in the heart of the person who calls somebody a fool. So he's not just talking about, sometimes we throw that word around. Oh, don't be a fool. You know, and that's not necessarily what he's talking about. He's talking about somebody who speaks it with hate in their heart for that person. And I think the context of this verse that I'm referring to, we're going to go ahead and read it. I think the context helps us to understand this. In Matthew 5:22, here's what Jesus said. I tell you that anyone who is angry, see, there's the anger, angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka. Now, the word Raka means an empty-headed fool. Another word is buffoon. Another word is idiot. When you call somebody an idiot with anger, with hate, with judgmental attitude, he says you're answerable to the court. And anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. Right? So the idea here is using the word fool as a curse, which reveals something about the heart of the person who uses this word. When I was a young teacher, I was teaching in the Corpus area. My first teaching job was in the Cal Allen School District in Corpus, and my second teaching job was just outside of Corpus in the Gregory Portland School District, GPISD, and I taught in Portland Junior High. And my first year there, I was, I was still a new teacher trying to figure out how to do my job well. And I met a teacher, another teacher, an art teacher, an older lady, and I think she and I were probably the only Hispanics on the faculty at that time. And so we got to know each other, and I kind of looked up to her, and she kind of taught me a few things about how things were done in that school and so on. But man, she did some artwork for me that I used on some of the choir programs, and so we developed a little bit of a friendship. But I discovered something about her, that she had a temper, and I didn't like the way she spoke to students. It bothered me. In fact, one time she and I were talking. It was after school. We're talking out there was a big area in the main building, kind of like a big big patio room. And so we're out there near the front of the entrance of the school, and we're talking, and there's this young man, an 8th grader, I know he was an 8th grader, young student who was walking toward us, and he's saying goodbye to his friends, end of the day, and he's just being a kid, he's just being silly. He's waving to them. He's walking backwards, and as he's walking backwards, he walked right into this teacher. He just bumped into her, and he must have hit her pretty hard. I don't know. He's just kind of, he's just a kid, He's just waving to his friends. And she got so angry at him. She turned around, and she looked at him, and she said, "You idiot! Why don't you watch where you're going?" And I felt so bad for that young man. He was like so apologetic, just a kid, just saying goodbye to his friends, just walking backwards, just being silly. But the anger in her voice has made me feel so bad for this student. And I don't know if she had hate for him in her heart, but it's that kind of reminds, when I read what Jesus said, I think about that instance, because there was just something really ugly about that moment. But that's not what God is doing when He calls this man in the story that Jesus told a fool. He's not doing it with anger. In fact, if anything, I believe God is calling his attention to the fact that he's making these decisions that are devoid of judgment, and certainly is compassionate toward him because of where it's going to land him. But here's what I want us to remember today from this story. That is that every one of us, I believe, is capable of this type of foolishness. Every one of us here is capable, not of the type of foolishness, I hope that this is true, that this teacher demonstrated, that Jesus describes in Matthew 5:22, but the type of foolishness in this parable that Jesus told. Every one of us is capable of this. And if God calls you a fool, then you can write it down. Folks, you're a fool. And that's something that we need to be concerned with. So what is foolishness? And how is foolishness displayed in our lives today? So let me draw 4 things out that I believe will help us today, so we can evaluate our lives against these highlights here, or lowlights, if you prefer. The first one is this: foolishness is pursuing our plans instead of seeking God's direction. Foolishness is pursuing our plans instead of seeking God's direction. In verse 17, Luke 12:17, this man who had this bumper crop said, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Now, he's had this abundant harvest. It was significant because his land was significant. In other words, the word translated ground, the ground of a certain man, had an abundant harvest. So this word translated ground in verse 17 is not a word that is used to refer to a piece of land, but it's a word that's used to refer to a large region. So he didn't just have a piece of land that had an abundant harvest. He had a large region. That word can also mean like a district. So it's a large area. We're talking about a super abundant harvest, so big that he didn't have room to store it. He had barns, but they weren't going to be enough for his bumper crop. Bigger than ever. So he had to plan. He had to strategize. He had to come up with an idea. But in all his planning, we don't see here that he ever sought God. In all his planning, he never mentions God. Foolishness is when we pursue our plans instead of seeking God's direction. And he made some plans. He made some in-depth plans. He thought of every possibility, every option for how to deal with his abundant harvest. And he came up with a plan outside of God's direction. And if you live your life independent of God, doesn't matter how creative you may be to come up with a great plan, how detailed your plans are, and how many resources you've got lined up, God will call you a fool if you don't seek His direction first. Because He knows what you're doing. You're building a house of cards. Now you might think, well, I asked God to bless my plans. But see, that's a problem. A lot of times what we do is we come up with our plans and then we say, okay, God, here's a plan. Would you now bless it? Would you now, as if by praying that God will activate our plan in our favor. But we don't engage God in leading us and speaking to us, whether through biblical principles or through people in our lives who can help us to process what we're going through and how we might interpret it correctly. And for some people, that's a description of their lives. It's foolishness. They only ask God to bless what they've already planned or what they've already done. So foolishness is pursuing our plans instead of seeking God's direction. Secondly, we learn from this story that foolishness is making ourselves a singular focus of our lives. Making ourselves a singular focus of our lives. Back to verse 17 and then verse 18. This man thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. Now, in these two verses, I went back and counted. 13 times he refers to himself. 13 times he makes a reference to himself. His life was all about himself. He was self-absorbed. Maybe you've come across people who are that way, who their conversation is always about themselves, and they kind of wear you out, don't they? uh, don't elbow anybody, and don't give any ideas of who you might be thinking of, but it happens. But we think, well, but not me. When I have a conversation, it's not all about myself. But again, remember that the foolishness of ingratitude is insidious. Because here's something that I believe very strongly, that I've learned over my long life, is that I believe that all of us struggle with pride to one extent or another. We all struggle with pride to one extent or another. For some, it's a real serious struggle. For others, maybe not as bad, but there's still that struggle for every one of us. I know that I do. We all do. We all consider our thoughts to be the wisest and our ways to be the smartest. It doesn't matter what the issue might be. We just always think that our stance is correct and everybody else is incorrect. Politics, yeah, I'm on the right side of what I believe is right. Attire, I would never wear that in public, right? Churches, everybody quit your church and start coming to mine because mine is the best. Somebody told me that one time. Not just me, but a group of us. Somebody said that. Everybody just stop going to your church, come to mine because mine is the best. It happened here in San Angelo. But sometimes our pride doesn't allow us to take advice, certainly not criticism. If you've ever read the book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, he talks about how it doesn't do us any good to criticize people. And he says this in his book: criticism is futile because it puts a person on the defensive and usually makes him strive to justify himself. Criticism is dangerous because it wounds a person's precious pride, hurts his sense of importance, and arouses resentment. And I think it's a good point. He's talking about just being critical all the time. But I think the truth also is that even if it's constructive criticism, some people just don't take that well. They don't. The truth is that it isn't too far for us to go from our natural struggle with pride to making ourselves a singular focus of our lives. Everything becomes about what makes me happy. Everything becomes about what's most convenient. Convenience and comfort are the two things that guide our thinking. Jesus would say, that's a foolish way to live. That's a foolish way to live. Here's the next one. Foolishness is keeping all our tangible blessings to ourselves without considering the needs of others. Keeping all our tangible blessings to ourselves without considering the needs of others. He says in verse 18, then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. So he had more than one barn. He had multiple barns, but he said, they're not big enough. I'm just going to tear them down so I can store my surplus grain. Now, let me tell you, there's nothing wrong with planning for the future. There's nothing wrong with saving money. In fact, there's something wrong if we don't do that. We should plan for the future. We should save. We're stewards of God's money, God's resources. We should do that. But what we see here is, we've already noted, we see a man who thinks only of himself, with no room in his heart to help others who might be, as we say, less fortunate. I was reading this week that one of the most profitable businesses in our country, and this is starting to be true in Europe as well, it has been true for a long time in our country, that one of the most profitable businesses is that of the self-storage businesses, self-storage buildings. I mean, they pop up all over the place, don't they? There's always one going up in San Angelo. I counted yesterday, just a quick Google search, 60 businesses in San Angelo alone. And then later I found, I think there's one in Grape Creek as well, and that wasn't counted in that. It's, people have a lot of things to store. They have so much that they can't store in their homes. Now, I realize some of those people might be in transition. They need a place to store their furniture and stuff. But a lot of it, and maybe most of it, is people who don't have room in their homes, in their houses. And some of those houses are pretty nice and spacious, and they still don't have room. But for some people, that isn't even enough. Having a place to store their surplus possessions isn't enough. They want, and maybe they need, climate-controlled storage. So we have climate-controlled storage. You pay a little extra so that your possessions won't sweat, I guess, or freeze. And so we've got a lot of stuff. We're a blessed nation. But let us be careful we don't fall into a situation where, like this man, we are looking for more and more ways to store our blessings when there are people that are in need. Let's learn to be generous. This man didn't have a generous bone in him that we read about. We know this, that generosity is good for the soul. Proverbs 11:25 reads like this: a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. It's just good for the soul when you're generous, not with your leftovers. Anybody can do that, but when you're generous with your surplus grain, with your surplus blessings from God. I have to say that I've learned to be generous from my wife. It hasn't been easy for me. I'm not as generous a person as she is, but I've learned over the years. Been married 40 years now, so I've seen generosity in her many, many times. And I've shared this story with you before, but one time my wife literally gave a woman the sweater off her back. It was a really nice sweater. I love that sweater. I used that sweater myself. For some reason, when our kids were little, toddlers and such, I always kept the heater in our house pretty low. I kept it cool in the winter, and we'd put those blanket sleepers on them overnight, so they were warm, they were fine. And I'd get up in the mornings to pray, and the house was chilly, so I'd get my wife's sweater, because it was a heavy sweater. It was a long sweater. That was my praying sweater. I'd put the sweater on, and I'd sit or walk or kneel or whatever. But I would pray with that sweater many, many days. And then she gave it away to a lady who admired it, said, "Oh, what a pretty sweater. I love that." And she said, "Well, do you want it? I'll give it to you." No. Of course, she protested. But the fact is, this lady needed that sweater. She and her husband were facing hard times, and she needed that. And so she finally took it, and I lost my praying sweater. And I haven't prayed since. No, I'm kidding. I still pray. I just don't pray with a sweater anymore. But, we're a blessed nation. And combined with our natural struggle with pride, we don't always look for a way to be a blessing to others. And God would say, that's a foolish way to live. That's a foolish way to live. A lot of times the way that we bless people, the way that we show God that we're grateful is by sharing, by being generous with others. And then the last one here, and I might take a little more time on this one, is this. Foolishness is thinking we control our future. Foolishness is thinking that we control our future. Look at verse 19. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This man was looking ahead to many years of ease. He was looking ahead to easy street, right? He didn't consider any other possibilities. It was just going to be easy street. He didn't consider the most obvious possibility, and that is that we're all going to die, and we don't know when. Every one of us here, every one of us will die, and we don't know when that'll happen. Now, we don't want to think about that because we like to be in control, but we're not in control, and it's foolish to think that we are. James wrote about this in James 4:13 and 14. James wrote this. He said, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Verse 14, why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. They're talking about, it's like a businessman, maybe some businessmen making business plans, business arrangements. For a year, we're going to make business, we're going to carry on business, we're going to make money in this city for a year. And James says, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow when you're planning for the year. Then he says, what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Now, James here is also talking about the foolishness of planning without God. There's not like in the parable that Jesus told, there's not a single mention of God in this entire business plan. It's a business plan. He knew what he wanted. He knew how to get there, but he didn't check it out with God first. So what James is telling us, what God is telling us, what Jesus is trying to get us to understand is, don't presume about the future. Don't presume about the future. Don't take it for granted as if things will always be the way they are right now. Don't do that. Because number one, life is unpredictable. And number two, life is brief. Life is unpredictable. In verse 14, James says, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. He's right. Life is unpredictable. There are no guarantees that things will stay the same way they've been, in the past few weeks or months or years for us. Now, I don't want that to frighten you. We shouldn't be frightened by the fact that life is unpredictable, that life is uncertain. There's nothing to be afraid about. It should cause us to trust God more. It should cause us to become more and more dependent on God. Life is unpredictable, and then this verse also tells us that life is brief. James says, you are a mist that appear for a little while and then vanishes. Now, the word mist here in the Greek is the word atmos, where we get the word atmosphere. You're just like the mist in the atmosphere. This verse always makes me think of when I was in the third grade. Remember, believe it or not, I remember when I was in the third grade. When I was in the third grade, our teacher had us memorize a short poem by the poet Carl Sandburg. I don't know if you know any Carl Sandburg poetry, but it's a little 6-line poem called Fog. And here's the way the poem goes. Fog by Carl Sandburg. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. We had to memorize that in the third grade, and it's just has stayed with me. I remember my classmates getting up and saying it, and I can even remember some of the voices of my, believe it or not, some of the voices of my classmates, what they sounded like. I had a friend in the third grade, her name was Laverne Jolly, and I can hear Laverne Jolly's voice standing up and saying this in a little third grade voice. But your life is like the fog. My life is like the fog. It rolls in the morning, it burns off by noon. Who knows how long we're going to live? The Bible describes, if you study this, the Bible describes our lives this way. Uses phrases like a leaf, grass, shadow, cloud, a puff of smoke, vapor, a mist. Life is short. So the warning here is don't presume that you have the rest of your life. Don't take tomorrow for granted. Don't presume about the future. Now, getting back to the parable, the problem wasn't that this man had a detailed plan. It was that he left God out of it. But the solution then is found in verse 15. Actually, I'm still in James. I'll get back to the solution in the parable. I'm still in James. The solution in the scenario that James has painted for us in verse 15, James 4:15. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or do that. If it is the Lord's will. One of the things that I love about my culture is that the way that people say, si Dios quiere. Now, I realize a lot of times I may say that without really meaning it, but I like that. I think at least it's a reminder. We're going to do something. Si Dios quiere. Nos vemos mañana. Si Dios quiere. If God wills, right? If God wills. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, si Dios quiere. Have a good day at work. Si Dios quiere. I think it's a good reminder, but not just to say it as a phrase, but to actually practice. We must include God because He controls our future. He controls our future. So it makes sense to look to God. He has our lives in His hands. And I believe that we should turn to Him daily, fervently, passionately. The last thing that I want to do is to make foolish decisions and not acknowledge God in my life. Here's a way that Jesus ended this story in verse 21, Luke 12:21. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. This is the definition of a fool. Don't store up things for yourself only. Don't make plans without including God, without waiting on God, without being patient so we can see and know God's will. Become rich toward God. Become rich in faith, rich in trust, rich in love toward God, rich in love toward others. Don't practice the sin of ingratitude. Don't practice foolishness. The foolishness of ingratitude. I want that to be our challenge as we spend this month focusing on being thankful to God. Don't let it become just a habit, something that we just do because it's November. But let it become a way of life. Evaluate your life today, tomorrow, this week. Evaluate your life on these things that warnings that Jesus gave. We can live foolishly, or we can do as Paul wrote to the Ephesians, we can live wisely. Let's choose to live wisely today. I'm going to invite you to bow for prayer. If you're watching us online, would you just pause what you're doing and let's just bow to the Lord in prayer. Go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we come to you today, thankful for your word and thankful for all the blessings that you have given us. We are grateful, dear God. We are grateful. But oh, how ingratitude, this foolishness of ingratitude, oh, how it is insidious, how it creeps into our thoughts without us even thinking, without us even realizing. So I ask that you would help us to be sensitive to our words, our thoughts, our life, the pride that we all struggle with. Help us to humble ourselves. Yes, God, I know you can humble us, but your word teaches us to humble ourselves under your mighty hand. That you, oh God, that you might raise us up in due time. Our trust has to be in you. This Christmas or this Thanksgiving season, and Christmas as well, but this Thanksgiving season, help us to be thankful, to live wisely, as we acknowledge all that you've done, as we devote our lives completely to you. We look to you in everything that we do, every decision, every step that we take. We turn to you, Father. In Jesus' name, amen.